Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on what I personally think is the biggest waste of opportunity when it came to developing and adopting a new service rifle or secondary service rifle for the US Armed Forces. And this weapon system here was one of the many experimental select fire carbines that were developed in the early to mid 2000s that could have replaced the venerable M4 carbine. And that weapon system is the Magpul PDR. The Magpul PDR was an experimental PDW type bullpup assault carbine that was developed between 2006 and 2011. It was first unveiled in 2006 by the Magpul Industries, a company that specializes in manufacturing futuristic weapons, with the goal of these weapons eventually being adopted by one or more branches of the US Armed Forces and other government security agencies. The weapon system overall is considered one of the most futuristic weapon systems developed in the year of 2006, at a time where bullpup PDW type weapons were being adopted by many of the First World Armies and militaries and police forces of the world. Weapon systems like the Belgian FNP-90, for example, were being widely adopted in many nations and are today some of the most common PDW type weapon system used by many armies and police forces across the planet. The Magpul PDR was one of the experimental weapons that could have been a game changer for the US Armed Forces. For one, this weapon system was extremely lightweight, weighing just 6.6 pounds when compared to most other rifles and carbines being tested or adopted at the time. This weapon system was bullpup and was chambered for 2 cartridges, the first 2 variants being chambered for the 5.56 by 45mm NATO standard cartridge, which were the same cartridge used in the M4 carbine, still being used by the US Armed Forces today. And there was also a third experimental version chambered in the 6.5mm Grendel and the 6.8mm SPC cartridges, which are 6.5mm cartridges that are meant to have more stopping power than the standard 5.56mm NATO standard cartridges, while being lighter and smaller than the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridges, or rifle cartridges. Now, the Magpul PDR is a gas-operated rotating bolt bullpup PDW weapon system and uses the standard Stanag magazine configuration, the same magazine used on the M4 carbine and other M16 and CAR-15 derivatives. The weapon has an overall length of 19 inches or 48 centimeters and has a maximum rate of fire of between 550 rounds to 650 rounds per minute, depending on the caliber. Its maximum targeting range is between 200 and 300 yards, and this weapon system here had 3 separate variants. There was the standard Magpul PDR, there was the Magpul PDRC, the C stands for compact, which had an FNP-90 style pistol grip and ergonomics, and there was the PDRD, the D stands for direct, that had a conventional pistol grip with a vertical foregrip in the front section of this weapon system. Now, like many PDW type weapons, this weapon was fully ambidextrous, meaning it can be used by both right and left-handed shooters, unlike most other infantry rifles. It is very similar again to the FNP-90, but also the Austrian Steyr AUG series of bullpup select fire assault rifles, which are also ambidextrous, like the FNP-90 and this weapon system here, the Magpul PDR. The weapon system was originally designed for vehicle operators, but later on, Magpul marketed it as an all-in-one infantry weapon system, a PDW that can be used by both the average infantry soldier and by vehicle and aircraft operators. The weapon is so lightweight, it can be fired and operated with one hand, theoretically speaking, which you really can't do with the M4 carbine and other long-barreled longer-barreled rifle systems or weapon systems that are currently being used by the US Armed Forces and by NATO countries that are supplied by the US that are supplied with US-grade infantry weapons. Now, if you ask me personally, I think the Magpul PDR was one of the biggest wasted opportunities for the US Armed Forces and the US security forces overall to adopt a newer, futuristic weapon system to replace many of the older Cold War vintage weapon systems that are still in service with the US Armed Forces, the federal police, and other government agencies. Now, the US again is still using the M4 carbine along with some of the more updated versions of the M4 carbine, but to me the M4 carbine is still just an M16/CAR-15 platform. Yes, it is a reliable weapon system from what I've seen, but it is a very old weapon system that to me should have been replaced at least 10 to 15 years ago. At this point, many of America's allies are currently replacing their old Cold War vintage weapons. For example, the French have finally replaced the FAMAS series of bullpup assault weapon systems, and the Italians have also upgraded their weapon systems too, adopting newer infantry rifles to replace the older Cold War vintage rifles that were in service with the French and Italian armies. Now, another reason I think this weapon system was a big piece of wasted potential is this could have been a very useful export weapon, just like the Belgian FNP90. The FNP90 is a very successful export PDW weapon system that has been adopted by a number of European and non-European nations, including some American law enforcement agencies that have also adopted the FNP90. Now imagine if the Magpul PDW, which uses NATO standard rifle cartridges or assault rifle cartridges, was to be marketed towards many of the NATO members that do not have the money to purchase full-size rifles and rifle carbines like the M4, or want to adopt a secondary or third-line weapon system to replace many of the smaller caliber weapon systems used by their armed forces, like submachine guns and machine pistols, for example. The PDR was also designed to replace submachine guns and machine pistols and semi-automatic handguns. It's literally an all-in-one weapon. It's a select fire PDW type carbine, technically a pistol because it can be used with one hand, and it is also a submachine gun to an extent, although it does use standard 5.56 cartridges instead of 9mm Parabellum or 45 ACP, which are standard cartridges used in most submachine guns and machine pistols. But again, those are just my opinions on it. I still feel like this is one of the biggest wasted potentials when it comes to futuristic American infantry weapons projects from the 2000s. And this is one of the few weapon systems that could be revived. Even though it was developed almost 20 years ago now, 2006, it is still a viable weapon system. It wasn't like it was outdated for the time, it was futuristic. It was very similar to the American Chris Vector in terms of how advanced it was for the time period. The Magpul PDR was ahead of its time when it comes to PDW type weapon systems that were developed in the United States at the time in the early to mid 2000s. And to me, again, it's one of the few weapon systems from that time period that could easily be revived and could easily be adopted either as a secondary weapon to the M4 carbine or as a primary replacement for the M4 carbine. Although that's clearly not going to happen, as the Americans are currently slowly adopting the HK-416 and other M4 type weapon systems as substitutes for the M4 carbine now in the US Armed Forces. But again, I still think the Magpul PDR should have been adopted by at least one or more branches of the US Armed Forces. If not the Marines or the Army, at least the National Guard or someone, or even the Navy or the US Air Force could have adopted this weapon and put it to use in some capacity. And again, from my perspective, it would have made a very useful export weapon. There are many countries that are supplied by the United States or that get their weapon systems from the US that probably would have invested in the Magpul PDR. They could have sold these weapon systems to a number of countries. I could think of several countries now that could use a weapon system like this that are currently supplied by the United States. The Ukrainian armed forces are currently being supplied with American weapon systems, including infantry weapon systems. Hungary, Moldova, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, So many countries that are allied with the United States, militarily speaking, that could benefit from having a lightweight PDW type weapon system that is basically an all-in-one system. It is both a bullpup select fire carbine, technically a submachine gun, and technically a pistol in terms of its weight and function. So what do you all think of this weapon system here? The Magpul PDR from 2006? I still think to this day it is one of the biggest pieces of wasted potential when it comes to American weapon systems that were developed in the early to mid 2000s but were ultimately rejected or were just ignored by the American armed forces and the American security agencies like the American police and the FBI and other law enforcement branches. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.